So I'm going to talk about interactivity, and ostensibly it's a talk about interactivity. It's more interesting to me, at least, to talk about some interesting data and some cool ways that you can learn from data that might be surprising. So we have this kind of thesis at Justin TV, which is that media is actually made up of two parts. There's content, me talking, you watching, things like that, and there's also response. And it's very easy to think about those two things as being separate, but kind of core to our service is that they both go toward the same value. And there's some really obvious examples of this. I'm going to show, excuse me, I'm going to show a video that
it is a multi-user experience. If you have a mouse, can't have two people using a mouse at the same time. In this environment, what we've done is we've created an interaction model which I don't think has been seen in any type of multi-user experience out there.
So that's a really obvious example of content and response being kind of one and the same. That wall might have some really interesting information. It might be fun to use, but it's pretty clear by watching that video that touching it, interacting with it is a big part of what makes it cool and interesting. We kind of have this idea, and synergy has become a dirty word in some ways. People use it for a lot of kind of marketing BS. But essentially it goes back to the idea that content and response, when you combine them, the resulting effect is greater than one on its own. I think watching those people touch that wall, it's pretty obvious that that's more interesting than if they were just touching the wall or they're just looking at the wall. We see it happen in some cool data, as I mentioned, in chat. So we have chat on the site next to video. Chat is cool. It also gives us a really good chance to dig into what people are doing, how it impacts the service. So the first thing that, in preparing for this, I looked up that was really interesting is how much people interact with chat related to how much they interact with the site. So this is not very surprising. The more people are on the site, the more they chat, but it actually gets kind of interesting toward the end. So the x-axis here is how many days in the last week a user has been on Justin TV. The y-axis shows you how many chat messages on average that group of users types each day. So if you've been on the site one day in the last week, you type about 18 messages of chat, each person does, each day. If you've been on the site every day in the last week, you type about 190 messages, chat messages per day. So that's 1,000 or so over the course of the week. What gets interesting is when you kind of map this back to the impact it has on the site overall. Oh, there's the increase, in case you couldn't do the math. So what's really easy to understand is that the really engaged group of users is smaller. There's less people that are on the site every day out of the week than only one day. But what gets interesting is when you look at the impact that those group of users actually have on the entire system. So, you have a lot at the front, but they don't do very much. So the impact kind of decreases over time or over engagement, which is not surprising. But then at the end, it actually spikes back up, which I was surprised to see, and so was our data team. So I'll trust that it's very surprising. And what's interesting here is that you learn that the really engaged group of users, even though it's only about 2% of users that are in that rightmost group, it's only about 2% of the site, but they make up about 17% of chat messages, and we'll use that as kind of a proxy for impact on the service. So even though it's a really small group, they make up about as much impact as the users in group 2, which are close to 20% of the site. So a group of 2% has as much impact as a group of 20%. From my point of view, very selfishly, that gives me a lot of leverage. If I can get those guys to do a little bit more, it has a huge impact. I don't need to affect that many people to have a really big impact. And when I kind of step back and think about the site, I have all these kind of helpers for you that I forgot I had. So there you see, population drops a lot, contribution drops not that much. When I think about the site, you come to the site, you see chat, that's going to define your experience of the site, whether I have any control over it or not. And in trying to figure out how I can, make that experience the best, it becomes obvious that the people on the right, the small group that's extremely engaged, are by far the highest leverage there. So, as soon as people interacting with your product, they essentially define your product. A user comes to your site, or a customer comes into your store, or whatever it might be, they see that whole experience, and the interactive part becomes a big piece of it. Something that I think often gets lost in this is the idea that interactivity has to be really core if you want it to affect what you're doing. And I use the word embedded and then made fun of tweet meme, which I mean no harm by, but a lot of people see stuff like that and want to put, a retweet button on their site and think that it's going to make it interactive. It won't. It will help people retweet your blog post or something, which is also valuable. But that's not really going to have an impact on your service. Just to go back to the example of Justin TV, it's kind of been built in parallel from the beginning, but there's by far, or I should say there are many other examples across the web of really interesting ways in which it's been done. But I think that as Twitter and other social services have become really popular, people have kind of thought of it as an afterthought. 37 Signals has this idea, excuse me, when they talk about design, they say that design shouldn't just be painted on. Design should be, designed from the beginning. The same should be said of interactivity, anything social. Any way you want to make your service or your product or your store or what you're doing, your ideas, spread beyond what you have to say about them, is that you need to think about how other people are going to say what they want to say from the beginning. Because if they're not saying it or if you're not thinking about it from the beginning, it's not really going to add value. And that to me is this retweet button. It's great and it serves a purpose, but it doesn't really change your service in a meaningful way. So